Great.
Now I just wait for it to load up on my YouTube thing to make sure everything's working. Because make sure that all the technical difficulties are figured out. Always, I had learned that the hard way. Always do that first.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, it looks like we're live. So Ben, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have another conversation with me. This
Yeah.
time we're going to have the conversation about does the historicity support the existence of miracles, if I believe correctly.
Oh, I think that I recalled from our last discussion that you had mentioned that you would like to talk about the resurrection. Am I remembering
Yes,
this?
yes, that is
Okay.
correct. Those are kind of the same topic for me, is like, is the resurrection reasonable to believe based off of the historical evidence or something like that?
Ah, I see. Okay. All right.
All right,
Sounds
so
good.
well, just for anybody who hasn't heard of you, would you like to give us an introduction or tell us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, sure. So I'm a full-time missionary evangelist. I do all of my work domestic, that is stateside. I'm involved in the work of Christian apologetics, and I'm part of the adjunct faculty for Teen Challenge Leadership Institute, where I teach New Testament and apologetics and Bible prophecy. I also run a Christian website called benfisherministries.com, where I've published a number of scholarly articles on a variety of topics related to Christian issues. And then in addition to that, I've done some conference speaking and guest speaking at churches. So the work that I do is very multi-appendaged at this point, and so it's been a fun ride for myself and for my family. I'm married to my best friend, and we have two children together. And the first is just turned 6 this February, and then our youngest, my daughter, turned 4 this July. So, did I lose you there?
No, we're good. I can hear you. Can you hear me still?
Okay, okay, because the screens just completely stopped moving,
Oh,
kind of like they did in our last discussion. So yeah, but that's probably enough about me. That's as much as.
well, you said you recently hit 100 subscribers on your YouTube channel. What is your YouTube channel? Like youtube.com/ what? Or is it just the?
Oh, sure, sure. If one did a search for like benfisherministries.com, you'd be able to see it. It would come up immediately.
All right.
So
All right, so
yeah,
just jump right in. I do not
sure.
believe that the historical evidence supports the belief or justified belief in the resurrection, and I imagine you do. So could you give me a reason why you believe that is the case?
Okay, so the resurrection of Jesus is would be the cornerstone of the Christian faith, and the evidence for it is assessed the same way that we assess evidence for virtually any historical claim. That we essentially evaluate these things using standard canons of criticism and inquiry. And when we do, we find that the hypothesis that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead rises above and beyond the other naturalistic hypotheses and shows that the best hypotheses would be the one that the Christian church has essentially preached since its inception, that Jesus was raised. So that's essentially the short version of the argument. There are a number of evidences which are virtually univocally held by those within the field of New Testament scholarship, and that field would include a wide plethora of persons holding a wide diversity of views, ranging from skepticism to Christian to atheism to agnosticism. And so the strength of these various historical facts, therefore, has to be reckoned with when attempting to assemble alternative theories. So essentially, the main facts that I hold to would be the origin of the Christian faith itself, that is, its religious novelty, as well as the appearance traditions that show that Jesus, or at least allege that Jesus, was indeed bodily raised from the dead. There is also, of course, the evidence of the empty tomb itself, which would be a part of the family of facts which would be related to the resurrection of Jesus. And I think that together these various clues and facts form a fairly impressive case. One could actually just simply set them up on a paper, list out various naturalistic alternative theories, and essentially play a game of resurrection bingo, if you will. Just see which of the hypotheses, which would rival the traditional Christian one, how they stand relative to each other and relative to the claim of the church. And so it's been my experience as I've walked this out in the context of both personal evangelism as well as in lecturing and in presenting on this, that the case is fairly strong for Jesus' resurrection, and it's certainly a valid inference. And so I take it to be the best alternative when compared to the others.
All right, let me tell you a little bit about my position. So,
Sure.
I like to give this quote from Michael Licona, a Christian historian. He says that most biblical scholars and historians hold to it that the study of miracle claims lies outside of the bounds of a historian acting within their professional capacity. And then he gives a list of all the people who do that. This is his paper, Historians and Miracle Claims. And so essentially,
Mm-hmm.
nothing in history can justify things that don't already have an empirical basis. So, for example, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. The difference between these two
Mm-hmm.
cases is that the dog has an implicit empirical basis. I mean, there's lots of empirical evidence of dogs that I'm just not mentioning in the
Sure. We've
statement I
seen
saw a dog.
dogs.
Right.
Yes.
And none of that exists for
Mm-hmm.
unicorns, which is why the statement I saw a dog is reasonable to accept because it has the conceptual testimony of my say-so in addition to the empirical evidence that I just haven't mentioned of dogs. Whereas the I
Mm-hmm.
claim I saw a unicorn only has my conceptual testimony, which is not sufficient for it to be reasonable to believe that a unicorn actually exists. And the same thing applies to history. Historical testimony, just like the claim that I saw a dog, is only reasonable to believe if it's claiming that there's something that we already have an empirical basis for, which means it's not reasonable to accept for miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, or UFOs, anything that doesn't have an empirical basis like that. And that seems to be the
Mm-hmm.
consensus among historians and biblical scholars, as far as I'm aware, given the Michael Licona quote, essentially.
Yes, yeah, I'm familiar with this approach to historical inquiry, and I, of course, admit that this is a standard uh, sort of methodology within the discipline. I certainly would agree that that's generally true. I don't think anyone would disagree, as indeed Mike Lycona's quote does offer, um, sort of betokens that very outlook. Um, this actually is very similar, however, to some of the arguments that I've heard in the past against the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, or for that matter, any other miracle in the scripture. Some time ago, I actually encountered this problem in a personal way. I was speaking with a stranger in a coffee shop on the Bible's radical claims, and I had grounded my presentation on the record of its histories when the man just sort of objected by declaring to me, "I don't accept your proofs." And so, questioning his reasoning, I just quickly gathered why. He obviously viewed science as the only road to reason. And since history would fail to meet the check of empirical testability, then history as a source of knowledge would, in that case, be less reliable than modern science. Similarly, in a kind of a similar way, the man also chose to lightly shun the scriptures. He denied their ability to offer us any facts which may be proven, for he held that all ancient texts would, at least in some sense, be generally unable to properly accredit their own innermost claims when compared to the study of science. And so, thinking like this is very, very common in our age, of course. I think you've described it well. It's a byproduct of the many incredible advances of the scientific information age. In fact, it's become, I think, so strongly believed as to be taken as a sort of a justification for rejecting alternative forms of knowledge. And so for this reason, scientist Stephen Hawking recently issued the claim, quote, "philosophy is dead. It is not kept up with modern science." And then he went on to sort of boldly, although I would say, albeit kind of naively, declare scientists have become the torchbearers of discovery in the quest for knowledge. And those kinds of claims, I don't know where you stand on those issues, but they fairly represent the norm in our time. They have garnered broad acceptance, earning thoroughgoing acclaim. And they've sort of arrived to us today as a throwback to an antiquated set of views previously held by thinkers in the earlier part of the 20th century, I believe. And of course, prominent among them, philosopher A.J. Ayer summarized these views in his book, Language, Truth, and Logic. And he later interestingly admitted, of course, that it was a, quote, young man's book written with, quote, more passion than most philosophers would allow. Here's what he said, and I have the quote ready here. We maintain that no statement which refers to a reality beyond the limits of sense experience can possibly have any literal significance, from which it follows that the laborers have been devoted to the production of nonsense. Now, that sort of an outlook really does dominate our world even today. It hasn't gone away. Radical uncertainty in a variety of things continues to clutter every corner in culture. And this, to me, is only made more clear by the work of historians like Hayden White, who asserts that historical texts should be treated as literary fiction. Well, for the same reason, philosopher Patrick Gardner also questioned, I have the quote here, in what sense can I be said to know an event which is in principle unobservable, having vanished behind the mysterious frontier which divides the present from the past? Well, to me, this kind of outlook has a way of sort of benching any possible miracle claims that might exist for us to evaluate, and sort of just reject the entire possibility of these things outright. But to me, that sort of approach fails to actually interact with the evidence that's right in front of us, the evidence in the claims themselves. And so back in the coffee shop, I just sort of grasped the man's point, and so I therefore began to sort of seek to refute it. I challenged him to soberly consider the consequences of this kind of belief, because the sacrificial loss of rejecting basically our certainty of historical knowledge would lead to the vast disappearance of all our antecedent histories. In fact, no one could any longer speak of our common prior beginnings. Any sort of substantive, meaningful reflection about our past would cease to betide us. Any hope of learning from our remotest mistakes would just become a frivolous exercise and bottomless vain conceit. And so I sort of questioned the man, if you're right, then what is history? I mean, how could we prove, for example, that George Washington even existed? I mean, it just seems to me that if we fault our knowledge of history as sort of uncertain, well, then in that case, there's nothing to prevent us from concluding that the past itself cannot be known. Well, shockingly, the man was all too ready to concede my point. I don't know where you stand on that, but he just was, yes, absolutely, that's the case. And so, void of the faintest shadow of reluctance, he willingly agreed. He assented, or he seemed to assent, to an opinion once held by atheist philosopher David Hume, whom I'm sure you know about, who rejected Christianity for being less provable than the evidence for our senses. Unfortunately, the man was also unaware of a gaping hole in his own reasoning. He was blinded, in my opinion, by a view of science which scientists themselves reject, because if disqualifying history as sort of non-empirical or truly justifiable, then the same argument would also serve to underqualify or disqualify science itself. Just returning to Stephen Hawking in his latest book, The Theorist's Muses, here's the quote. Until recently, it was thought that our knowledge of the world could be attained through our senses. But the spectacular success of modern physics has shown that this is not true. Now, I won't get into all the reasons now why I basically felt like the person was not really coming from an epistemically responsible position. But I just think that some of the reasons that people just simply bench the possibility of miracles fail to actually interact, in this case, with the claims of the Christian faith itself. And so I feel like it's a wonderful, adventurous experiment for the atheist to go into the evidence and just see what it says, and a kind of, just lay down preconceptions and see what we might learn from the text, and just let the facts speak for themselves. And so that's kind of the approach that I take. And there are other reasons, I suppose, that I could justify that the methodologies of history are just as certain as the current methodologies for modern science. And I've written extensively on this. I've lectured on it. And I think it's generally, it's at least persuasive to me. Let me just say that. So.
All right, so you mentioned a lot of different people there, but none of them hold my position. So none of them really have anything to do with my position. I wrote
What do you
my
mean?
own, I wrote my own epistemology here. So the argument I gave was that,
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's the very first video on my YouTube channel, in case you're curious. There's a few of them on there.
Oh, I'll have to give that a look.
Yeah, so my position was the analogy I used was if I told you I saw a dog, that's reasonable to believe, and if I told you I
Mm-hmm.
saw a unicorn, that's not reasonable to believe. So if
Mm-hmm.
we apply this same principle to history, everything in history that has an empirical basis is reasonable to believe. So the only things it excludes from history is miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs, and that's it. Everything else is
Mm-hmm.
kept. So I evade the problems of logical positivism and the rejection that history is empirical completely. None of that has to do with my position because mine doesn't have those same problems because I accept everything in history except the things that lack an empirical basis. So
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
grant that there can be forms of knowledge that are not empirical. So I'm not a logical positivist, not a logical empiricist like A.J. Ayer. And those things are totally fine in context, but they in history, if you only have those things, then they're not reasonable to justify belief in things that don't also have the additional kind of empirical evidence, which would only include, as far as I know, miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
that methodology seems to align with what most historians agree upon. And so I accept history as a kind of evidence and as a justifiable kind of evidence, but
Right. Right.
only in certain contexts.
That delights
Which,
me, by the way.
yeah,
So that's good. Yes. Well, here's the thing: is that I just so you know, I would join you in essentially saying that the idea that so and so, just say person S, saw a unicorn. I would join you in saying that I, of course, don't believe that. Um, but here I think that we both have to ask the question: does that belief count as knowledge? And to me, that's the critical question to ask. And I think that
our
I,
belief or the person who's speaking's belief.
no, our belief. Does our belief count as knowledge? Which gets back to the question, what is knowledge? Now, from the days of Edmund Gettier, everyone has concluded that our current view of what knowledge is ostensibly incomplete. But
I'm
it'll
sorry, just to
even
interrupt.
Gettier
So
himself
just to interrupt. So is this our belief that their statement is not
is false. Is false.
false?
So you and I both agree that person S making the claim that they saw a unicorn is false. And I would say I would join you in saying that I believe that that's true. But does our shared belief count as knowledge? That's the question I'm asking here. And essentially, I'm admitting that our current definition of knowledge, according to modern philosophy, is ostensibly incomplete. Absolutely, that's true. Everyone knows that now since Edmund Gettier's famous 1963 paper, in which he sort of upset the apple cart and started a flurry of activity, scholarly activity around the question.
Right, the
But I
Gettier
think
problems.
even he admitted, this is the issue. Even he admitted that knowledge was minimally justified, true belief. And so, probably a skeptic would add to that list and say, well, the missing component from Gettier's list that he couldn't answer, he left the question open. But the missing component here would be certainty. Okay, whatever you would like to add to that. But on the basis of that sort of a definition, I would say that you and I would have to admit that our belief that person S saw a unicorn does not count as knowledge. For knowledge, we need some sort of a justification for that. And the only way to come upon a carefully, well reasoned, case for or against person S's claim is for us to look at the grounds of his own justification and basically judge is that possible? Did he really see a unicorn? Because I think at least we would say that it's not knowledge.
Right, I totally agree. I would say that my objection
Mm-hmm.
to the historicity of Jesus' resurrection is the fact that it's not justified based off of the evidence given in history. Like, for example, the claim I saw a unicorn is not justified. It could be true, we just don't know it because it doesn't count as knowledge because it doesn't have the justification required for it to count as knowledge. And the same thing is true of the resurrection. Even if there
Yeah.
isn't evidence of the resurrection, it could still be true. Like I'm not trying to disprove the resurrection, but my argument
Mm-hmm.
is that the given testimony is not reasonable as justification to make it reasonable to believe that it did. Just like the claim I saw a
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
unicorn isn't justification to make it reasonable to believe a unicorn exists.
Sure, sure. And essentially, my thought here is that this idea of just sort of benching the possibility of the supernatural from the outset, just sort of excluding it from the scene of inquiry, potentially, and I think plausibly, commits the logical fallacy, the informal fallacy of something called petitio principii, begging the question, that essentially the person denying the miracle claim is just sort of decided from the outset that miracles are unreasonable. Again, that's a belief, but what is the justification for that belief? Has the person, for example, done a meticulous scrutiny of every single miracle claim that has ever been made to be able to say that all miracles should be excluded? I think that minimally would be required for a person that would say, I have a justification that would lead to me saying that my belief that person did not see a unicorn at all, he saw no such thing, or he saw something that perhaps was different. Maybe he saw a rhinoceros or something like that. I think that again, when it comes to this issue, if we're not going to commit the informal logical fallacy that I mentioned, then perhaps we have to say, all right, well, then let's just simply assess this singular miracle claim, since we're not in a position to go and scrutinize every single miracle claim, which would include not just resurrections, but every ghost story in history. I mean, just think of the number of stories that we would have to sort of go through in order to, the amount of work, the monstrous amount of work required to even justify that belief. And so maybe we should just sort of rein back the conversation and just say, all right, well, let's just at least look at person S's claim. Did you really see a unicorn? What is your justification for that? Please explain yourself, sir.
Well, absolutely. So just to clarify, my position isn't miracles are impossible or miracles are prima facie unreasonable to believe. My claim is that the historical testimony isn't sufficient to justify belief in miracles. So miracles could absolutely be possible, and it can absolutely be shown. They can be tested. Like if you can pray for someone to regrow a limb and they regrow a limb and it happens consistently, that's evidence of a miracle. So I'm not rejecting the possibility of miracles at all. It's totally a possibility. Just like I wouldn't reject the possibility of a unicorn existing. It's totally possible unicorns can exist. The only thing I'm rejecting is that no amount of testimony, that which I call conceptual evidence, is sufficient to justify an empirical claim about what exists in reality. So if you claim I saw a unicorn, you're claiming that there exists a unicorn in reality which you happen to see. And that's the conceptual evidence of what happened in your head, your experience, in addition to a claim about something in the world, independent of your head. So you need the evidence not only of what happened in your head, which is what you saw, but you also need some kind of backing evidence about something in the world, which I use empirical evidence as my basis for that. So the same thing would apply to miracles. It's not about rejecting the possibility of miracles. It's that because we have no empirical evidence to support miracles, the miracle is like the unicorn. Just saying you saw it exist is not sufficient evidence to justify belief it exists. You need that empirical basis before it becomes reasonable.
Right. Well, I think here that essentially, excuse me, when it comes to, hold on a second. I just got my water there for me just in case I have any acid reflux. Some rich food today. So, essentially, I think that if we are to sort of reject the possibility that there could be empirical evidence for a miracle, again, to me, this just sort of begs the question. The methodology has been constructed in such a way so as to cleverly preclude the miracle cases that exist in ancient history and ancient literature, as well as, I might add, modern day evidence as well. There, for example, has been a 2-volume set which Craig Keener, who's one of the most prodigious New Testament scholars of our time, as well as Gary Habermas, have put together to essentially silence, not to put too fine a point on it, the atheist conversation here. And incidentally, I watched a film of Craig Keener's, basically his opening talk on the release of this massive 2-volume set on miracles, chronologing, the cases for miracles that exist, that are present even with us today. And I was interested to see that he cataloged actually a story of a person, a miracle that occurred in the life of a person whom I have had the opportunity to talk to. In fact, the prayer that gave rise to the miracle itself was prayed by a person that I have personally known since my childhood. And so I was astonished to see that here Craig Keener, this New Testament scholar, this giant, had actually gone to the trouble of interviewing this individual. This was a case of a person who actually, his name was Bruce Venata. A car fell on him, and as he was working underneath of it, and the axle for the car actually just about severed his abdomen, severed his body in two. He actually lost 13 feet of intestine. They airlifted him to the hospital. He barely survived. It left about this much. I mean, his spine would have snapped completely, and he would have been dead at that point. But his spine held together, and so they removed the car, airlifted him to the hospital. He laid there dying of malnutrition because he didn't have enough intestine to actually absorb the food that the people were trying to feed him in the hospital. And then my friend that I've grown up that I just mentioned, he was actually over in Buffalo, New York at the time, and said that he claimed in his own testimony that he heard a voice speak to him in his head, telling him, "I want you to go and pray for this individual to have them raised up from the hospital bed." And he didn't like the idea, so he stalled on it for 2 days. Finally, he talked to his wife, and she said, "I think you better go." So he got on a plane and flew over there unannounced, and just pulled the curtain aside, said that Jesus has sent me here to pray for you to be raised up from your sick beds. And then he said, "In the name of Jesus, be healed." And instantly, like that, the man suddenly grew 9.5 feet of intestine right there in the hospital. And the doctors were completely perplexed and amazed by this. The story ended up launching Bruce Venata's ministry, which is still going on today. You can check out his website, Sweet Bread Ministries. And the interesting thing about this is that the History Channel went on to take a number of cases of quote-unquote purported miracles and to study them under close third-party scrutiny to see whether or not they were indeed legitimate medical cases of miracles. They went through 25 of them. 24 of them were all false, except for Bruce Venata's case. In Bruce Venata's case, this was indeed, according to the History Channel, a miracle. And as I studied the lengthy medical file, because these files on this kind of stuff are just massive, they actually found not just that that was the only miracle that occurred, but a number of other miracles that occurred just in him getting to the hospital and remaining alive, et cetera, things that cases where he definitely should have died, didn't. And so the History Channel said, well, this is a genuine case of a miracle, and we don't know what else to say about that. I found it interesting that story made it into Craig Keener's volume because Bruce is a friend of mine, and I talked to him not too long ago about this, and it was just really phenomenal. And stuff like that. There's apparently a whole large list of other cases like this. So, if it is the case that there can be evidences of miracles on that level, for example, happening even in modern times, then why not take a gander, if you will, at the evidence from the New Testament for the resurrection and just simply see if it's possibly true?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I've read both Craig Keener's and Gary Habermas's book. I personally don't consider those to hold up to the standard of what qualifies as empirical evidence, but if they did, you would absolutely be right. So if we can actually demonstrate miracles today, then it's reasonable to infer that the miracles happened in the past as well. And so it would be reasonable to believe the miracles things in the Bible.
Now, when you say demonstrate, do you mean demonstrate on the basis of textual evidence as of a sort of a literary witness, or are you saying demonstrate as in the sense as I lay my hands on you, TJump, and let's say that you've got colonitis or some sort of a strong case of some medical illness, and then you get healed? What do you mean by demonstrate?
Novel testable predictions. So you'd have to show repeatability, testability, verifiability, consistency.
Right. That's kind of what. So in other words,
but I mean,
no
that's just
literary witness would persuade you. Is that
correct? You would need to actually be able to demonstrate it exists empirically, verifiably today in the present. Now we can but that's a different argument. So we can grant that since if we say Craig Keener's and Gary Habermas's work actually did were empirical evidence, then it would be reasonable to extrapolate into the past and say, yes, it's possible that they happened in the past too. Like if we discovered a unicorn today, then it would be reasonable to look at historical accounts of seeing a unicorn and say, maybe they really did see a unicorn. That's now reasonable to believe. Because now then that would be like the claim, I saw a dog. Since we have empirical evidence of dogs, it's reasonable to believe historical testimony that they saw a dog. So if we have empirical evidence of unicorns, it's reasonable to believe historical testimony of unicorns. And if we have empirical evidence of miracles, it's reasonable to believe testimony of miracles.
Sure.
So
Are you a fan of Nassim Taleb?
What is that?
Nassim Taleb.
I do not know who that is.
Okay, Nassim Taleb was a probability theorist, and part of the constituency of persons that witnessed on Wall Street, as actually watching it happen live, the collapse of the stock market some years ago. And he went on to essentially write a book called The Black Swan Theory. Others conjectured that he had essentially taken the equivalent, the probability equivalent to Luther's 95 Theses, and nailed them to the wall in Wall Street, and essentially showed we are just a bunch of we're not to be taken any more seriously than astrologers are to be taken in our modern time. We have nothing to say to show that your portfolio will probably look like this sometime from now. But essentially, the thesis of the book was very, very fascinating. He said that essentially everyone in the Western world believed that only white swans existed, and from the days of even Julian, the historian from Rome, that even as far back as those times, that everyone held that a black swan was an absolute absurdity. And so, in other words, people would say such proverbial statements as the existence of an honest woman is kind of like trying to find the existence of a black swan. It doesn't exist, so you're not going to find it because they don't exist anywhere. And we already know that that's true. And of course,
One sec, you cut out. I can't hear you. Wait for your video to refresh. Okay, now keep going. What?
okay, so all of this thought just kind of continued in Western culture until old world naturalists actually stepped onto the shores of Australia, and lo and behold, a black swan swam by. So, in other words, you can't predict the unpredictable. You can't just simply exclude this from the possibility of what's probable. You have to actually ask the question. I know that I believe that there are only white swans and that a black swan does not exist, but that doesn't mean that it does. And that kind of gets back to what I'm saying here is that does that belief count as knowledge? Since it doesn't count as knowledge, then that would, I think, encourage the atheist to enter into a sort of reasoned speculation on the basis of the testimony of the New Testament as to whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead. If, when studying that, according to the way that we normally sift evidence, we find that this is true, then I think we're faced with at least one case that has seriously confronted our naturalistic beliefs about the world in a dramatic way, I think.
Well, I
So,
totally agree. So again, my position on miracles is the same as my definition of atheism, which we talked a little bit about over email. I'm not rejecting the existence of miracles like I don't reject the existence of God. My claim is purely epistemic. I just think there is no justification for that. I clearly think it's possible. I would never reject the possibility. And like the black swan example, Newtonian physics, all of the Newtonian physics was shown to be correct inductively over and over and over again. And then we showed with general relativity and Einstein that nope,
right,
there's actually something else. That there's a black swan.
right, right,
So,
right,
so,
right.
so again,
Yeah,
my position is just that it's unreasonable to believe the claims of the resurrection because testimony is not enough to justify the belief in something that doesn't have an empirical basis. You need the empirical basis in addition to the testimony. The testimony isn't good enough. For example, in a court case, if I went into a courtroom and said, I saw a guy wave a wand and a green light came out and it was cast a magical spell to kill somebody, that would immediately be thrown out
hmm
of court. Like there is 0% chance he would get convicted. If there were 500 people who saw this happen and said somebody used magic to kill somebody, immediately thrown out of court. Doesn't matter how many eyewitnesses you have, because there's no precedent for miracles or magic in this case. Sorry, magic. So if
right.
so the same thing in a
Yeah.
courtroom, the same thing applies. Testimony doesn't work to support things that don't already have precedent, to use the technical legal term, but or an empirical basis in the term of my epistemology. If you don't already have that, like you don't for miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, no amount of testimony is going to be qualifiable in a courtroom or in history or in any scientific field because testimony isn't sufficient. And the reason is because we need some way to differentiate
Yeah.
between our imagination and what's real. Like the first claim of any epistemology is you have to be able to differentiate, is object X an imaginary thing or is object X a non-imaginary thing, a real thing? And the
Hmm.
criteria we use to do that is what establishes an epistemology. And if your criteria can't differentiate between an imaginary and real thing, then it's a bad criteria. It's not sufficient to justify or give you a
Mm.
warranted belief in something
Ah.
existing.
Well, yeah, I would just kind of go back to our email exchange that we had here, and just simply pull out the possibility that this is just simply an argument from skepticism. Because if we can't show, for example, if we let's just say that if if I if I know that let's be seeing how would I frame this argument? if I if I know that naturalism is true, then I could never find there would be no evidence for miracles. There is no evidence for miracles. Therefore, naturalism is true. And to me, this kind of thing, to where we just sort of presuppose naturalism, I think we've got to go back to the question of whether or not we know that no miracle has ever happened. I just think that's a belief, sure. So the skeptic in this case believes that there's no supernatural world that exists metaphysically above one tier from our world itself, and I understand that that's a belief, but what is the justification for this?
Well, again, I'm not
Does it
rejecting
count
the
as knowledge?
possibility. I don't reject the possibility of the supernatural, just to be clear. That's not, I grant the possibility of the supernatural. I'm not a metaphysical naturalist, so just to be clear on that.
Oh, okay. Well, then perhaps I need to hear you explain your argument a bit more clearly.
Right, so I'm a methodological naturalist, which means I think we only have reason to believe the natural exists for the time being. There could absolutely be a supernatural. There's no problem there. We just need a way, some kind of evidence that can differentiate the supernatural from an imaginary thing. Like, for example, say I imagined a leprechaun or something and say, I saw a leprechaun. Well, how do we show if the leprechaun is something in the world or if it's something in my head? And then we need to get some qualification, some criteria of evidence to differentiate between the two. Which one is this? Is it the thing in our head or is it the thing in the world? Now, the criteria I use that I find the most reliable is novel testable predictions. That's the one science goes with. And if it fails
Yes.
this criteria, then I believe it to be one of the imaginary things and not one of the real things.
Right, right, and so I of course understand that. But what do we do with, for example, Hawking's last book, in which he mused, "quote Until recently, it was thought that all our knowledge of the world could be obtained through our senses, but the spectacular success of modern physics has shown that this is not true." So
Well, there's a
if even a scientist on the level of Hawking is essentially saying that we have to sort of presuppose the existence of the universe because, quote, the universe has no independent existence, and it's therefore up to the scientist to simply assume it indirectly. That is fundamentally no different from the work of the historian. Belief in the claims of the past would simply be a rational leap of reason. It would be inferred on the basis of overwhelming evidence drawn from universal human experience. And so this is, to me, one of the reasons why we need to, epistemically, we need to hold these kinds of ideas loosely. We have to ask, is this belief knowledge? How do I know it's knowledge? What would be the justification for that? Why, just going on the skeptic's own argument. If you want to show that something is knowledge, then you have to show that all the contraries to that knowledge claim are false. Unless or until you do that, then this first proposition is just simply a belief, but it's not a true justified belief.
uh, there's
It doesn't rise
two
to
things
the level
there.
of criterion to establish it
Well,
as
two things there.
knowledge.
First, that's not the case. In order to qualify as knowledge, you don't have to rule out every possibility as being false. In
I agree with you.
There's this thing in
I
philosophy.
agree
It's
with you on
called the
that point.
position of fallibilism, which is the consensus among philosophers. You just that's just not a part of any worldview right now, as far as or any well-founded worldview, as far as I know. The second thing was when
I would agree that it's not well founded, but skepticism is still absolutely live and large in the technical literature. It is still vehemently discussed and argued back and forth. And that
well,
simple argument, if I know that H, then I know that not SK. I do not know that not SK. Therefore, I do not know that H. That
um,
sort of epistemology is absolutely still hotly contested. Now, I disagree with it. I think there are good arguments against it. I'm glad that you disagree with it, but I say that no, I don't think that's the case.
well,
Fallibilism would be yet another model. So go
Well,
ahead
again,
and
skepticism is an extreme minority position in philosophy. The majority position is fallibilism. For both atheists, naturalists, theists, everybody, fallibilism is like the huge majority position in philosophy right now. Skepticism is a very minority position. You can check the Pew something survey, Pew Phil Survey's paper for the percent of philosophers who adopted different worldviews. But there was a second thing you mentioned, which was the Hawking quote. The Hawking quote, there's an equivocation between senses there. When he says the senses can't be reliably used to describe reality, he means that we use machines to do it instead of our senses. But in the context of epistemology, that would still be our senses because we're using our senses to read the machines. So that would still be using our senses to learn about reality, but in indirect
why then does he
observation.
say, "quote The universe has no independent existence"? It's therefore up to the scientist to assume it indirectly. I think Hawking has
That's
shown.
that's indirect observation. We can't actually observe quantum physics. We have to use machines to do it.
Well, I think that this shows it's therefore up to the scientists to simply assume it indirectly, as I'm showing here. I think that belief is fundamentally no different from what we see in the case of historical methodologies. I think that therefore, since history and science are on equal par, then we've got to assume that that's true. Empiricism itself is actually a close cousin to the argument of infinitism, which Sextus Empiricus walked out in the 2nd century against Plato's Academy, is one of the three classic reasons that Plato's Academy, their view of quote unquote direct skepticism, was false. Because if you, and we talked about this before in our last discussion, if we always prove something on the basis of something else, then eventually whatever set we start with, call it contingent proposition A is proven by B, is proven by C, is proven by D on to Z. Once we get to Z, what do? Do we go back to Y? No. The infinitist argues that we've got to go to A prime, B prime, C prime, and this continues on and on forever. That means A is eternally a contingent proposition, which means nothing can actually be proven or settled or probative, in which case, why argue with the Christian that he can't prove his quote unquote view or model of Jesus' bodily resurrection? If that hypothesis is unprovable, so what? So is the skeptics. Everything is unprovable. And to me, that's just, I can't agree with that when there are other alternatives to infinitism, which offer better arguments for how we might come upon settling an issue as probative. And so,
Well,
yeah.
I agree, but none of that has to do with my position. I'm not an infinitist. I don't hold that position. I'm not a skepticist, or I don't hold to skepticism. So again, I'm not sure how those relate to my position. So I agree with you the criterion of knowledge is justified true belief. And the
Okay, good.
criteria I'm explaining or articulating is that in order for something to be justified, in my epistemology, the way I phrase it is this: conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. Now, so if I make a claim like a testimony, I saw, that's a conceptual
Wait a
claim.
minute. Metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence?
Yeah, but that's a totally different topic. We haven't gotten into that at all, but
Yeah, I don't think that's true. A metaphysical claim, for example, that there is a supernatural world, if there were miracles that occurred in this world, then that would be a case of something metaphysical that is manifesting in the natural. And so to me, therefore, this natural knowledge, what we can see in this case, would actually point to the said existence of that higher metaphysical realm.
metaphysics is the fundamental first principles of reality, and including ontology, what exists. So everything that exists would be a metaphysical claim. But that's again,
But
it's
spiritualism would
more
be a form of metaphysical reality, wouldn't it? I mean, it's a
everything that exists is a form of metaphysics. Ontology, which is a branch of metaphysics,
sure,
is the
sure.
study of what
So is
exists.
naturalism,
Right.
etc. Yeah,
So everything that exists is a form of metaphysics. But that's
yeah, yeah.
my specific definition there would be contextualized into apply to the same things like absolute certainty.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
that's a different topic that's not related to the historicity. So just focusing on the historicity right now, my claim is that no amount of testimony, eyewitness testimony, personal testimony, no amount of eyewitness sources is ever going to make a argument justified to believe something that doesn't have an empirical basis. So we have hundreds of eyewitness testimonies of the Loch Ness Monster. We have thousands of Bigfoot. We have tens of thousands of ghosts. We have hundreds of thousands of homeopathy, millions of Hindu miracles, all kinds of things. We have, if I showed every human being a picture of an optical illusion, they would all see it moving. I have 100 billion, if we include the dead people,
Sure.
100 billion eyewitnesses that the thing is moving. No amount of
Mm-hmm.
eyewitness testimony is reasonable to justify things existing in the world like unicorns. For that, you need an empirical basis. You need some kind of criterion that can differentiate between our imaginary and our real, and testimony cannot do that. Testimony completely fails as a evidential criterion to be able to differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. So we need something else. We need some other kind of evidence that can differentiate between what's imaginary and real in order to make the belief that this is a real thing a justified belief. And until you can do that, if all you provide is like testimony, because that can't differentiate it between imaginary and real, the testimony doesn't make a belief that the thing is real justified. Does that make sense what I'm arguing?
Yeah, yeah. To which the theist might reply, and I'm sure you see this coming. Fancy notion, fancy model. Yes, it does. It does work rather well in that case, doesn't it? To sort of preclude the possibility. And this is why, again, that's why I think that since it's obviously not a knowledge claim,
Well,
I think
it is a
I
knowledge
think that
claim.
I think that, well, what is the justification for this? Have you gone and actually shown that all of the essential miracles that are out there,
Well, again, because
that
I'm
none
using
of them?
fallibilism, I don't need to do that. That's not a relevant position to fallibilism. All I need to do is show that this is a justified position. I don't need to actually prove it in every possible case.
Okay, yeah, I just think that if it's if you're saying that that's the case, then you are probably adding a category to true justified belief, something else that
No,
shows.
I'm still using that. Still using the true justified belief criterion. I'm
Right,
just
but
qualifying what
if that
justified
list
means.
is incomplete, if that list is incomplete, I mean, to the list, for example, the three true justified belief, the skeptic adds certainty. You're saying no, I preclude that. All right, well then, what are you adding to that to
Nothing.
qualify what knowledge is? To
Nothing.
show what is the justification?
I'm not adding anything. I'm still using justified true belief. I'm just qualifying what it means to be justified.
Right, that's what the skeptic's doing. He's saying the certainty is the thing which
No,
justifies, which shows what justification is. To
no.
justification, we add certainty, and therefore true justified belief becomes knowledge. I'm saying in this case, what is it that you're proposing that we add here?
Well, I'm not adding anything. Again, this is something that hasn't been added. This is just a standard across most fields of knowledge, is that
Hmm.
if you can't differentiate between imaginary and real, then logically by default, like for example, if I said I rolled a
How
dice,
is that different from skepticism? I know if I know that something is real, then I know it's different from imaginary. I don't know that it's not different from imaginary, therefore I don't know that it's real. That's skepticism. That is essentially the classic formulation of the argument. In which case, the theist might reply, "Well, then how do you know that anything is true? How do you know that knowledge? How do we know that we can know any true propositions that you and I would, for example, basically claim to share?"
well, again, that representation is not at all how I'm trying to make the argument. So mine doesn't follow that formula at all. So my argument
Oh,
is like,
well, then I would have had to have misunderstood you.
right.
Please keep going.
Think about it this way. Imagine if I shake a magic 8 ball and the magic eight
Hmm.
ball says unicorns exist.
Hmm.
Now, the magic 8 ball cannot differentiate between real things and imaginary things. So the magic 8 ball is not a reliable source of knowledge. So believing something the magic 8 ball said is not a justified belief about what exists. Would you agree with all of that?
Sure, sure. I just don't think that, for example, a miracle would need to be something that would be empirically beholden to the entire world, every
Oh,
single observer on planet Earth seeing a miracle in order to establish that it's a
right.
miracle.
I
If it
would never
happened
say that. I
in a
never
given
said that.
person's life,
I
well,
never
if it
said
happens
that.
in a given person's life, then you've got to have some sort of a literary or a sort of some sort of a set of claims that what that person S is adhering to, in this case, and so you would have to be able to say, well, then are those claims are do they stand up to normal standards of evidence? And so,
Right,
uh,
right. That's I agree with all of that. I'm not
yes,
saying I'm not excluding miracles at all. So again, just go with the magic 8 ball example.
okay,
The magic 8 ball is not a reliable source of knowledge. So if you claim that something is true, like unicorns exist because the magic 8 ball says so, that is not a justified belief because the magic 8 ball is not a reliable source of knowledge. Would you agree?
yes, yes, I would agree that a magic eight ball.
Right.
By the way, I just have to say this. I love you, man. this
Thank
is
you. Thank you.
this is great. I love having these conversations. So this is a wonderful treat for me to be able to get to talk to you. So
Okay, okay.
I
So
don't know if
so
we just blew anybody's mind who's watching who might be an atheist.
yeah, yeah. So the reason the magic 8 ball is not a reliable source of knowledge is because the magic 8 ball cannot differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real, right?
Sure,
That's what makes it not a reliable source.
absolutely,
So
I
if
would
there is
agree.
some other source you're using that also cannot differentiate between the imaginary and real, it's also not a reliable source for the same reason the magic 8 ball is. Now I'm
Yeah, and
arguing,
I would say that I'm in disagreement on the point that a person's testimony, a person's own testimony to having witnessed a miracle, is de facto excluded as evidence, because that would mean, therefore, that the only way for um, purported person S and, and others, or just let's just label we, and we symbolizes everybody else on planet Earth knowing whether or not person S's claim is right. They would all have to see it, and that only that would justify
well, that wouldn't
that person
justify.
S
So
really did experience a miracle.
so again, I'm saying no amount of testimony would justify this. So even if every human being saw it, that still wouldn't justify it because like my example with the optical illusion. But so
Oh,
just going back,
oh,
my example is that if you have a magic 8 ball that is not reasonable to believe because it can't differentiate
I
between what's
lost you
a
for a
mag.
second there.
Okay, am I back? Let me know when I'm back.
Yeah.
Let me
You
know when
sound like you're in the Matrix. Are we in the Matrix?
I'm.
Just kidding.
Checking sound. Can you hear me still? Is everything fine?
It's coming clearer now. Maybe it's over. It
All
was a
right.
glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah, yeah. It's been saying a couple times that you've lost connection a little bit, so I think you might be, but I think it
Are you
might be
getting
on your end.
complaints on your channel?
No, it's there's the website thing I'm using. It's showing low connection on your end
Oh, there's a low connection on my end. Oh gosh.
because I'm showing 5,000 kbs per second for the transmission speed, so I'm pretty sure I'm good. But
Oh, it's Comcast.
yeah, so
Yeah,
you can hear me
sorry.
now. You can hear me
Sorry.
now.
I can hear it just fine. Yeah, why
Okay.
don't you keep going?
Okay. So again, now I'm not saying anything about
So you're saying that
science.
even if
Right.
everyone saw the miracle, that still would not be enough, even
Right.
if we all saw it.
Right. So I
But
just
isn't
want
that
to
empirical evidence? If you
not
see it with
based off
your
my
eyes, isn't that
definition.
doesn't that count as empirical evidence?
Not based off my definition because my definition is novel, testable, repeatable, verifiable, those kinds of things. But that's I want to go. I want to move away from that for a minute. So going back to my example, the magic 8 ball is not a reliable source because it can't differentiate between what's imaginary and what's real. Now, there are lots of things that may be able to. I use science and testable predictions. That's not the only thing. There could be other ways to do it. I'm totally fine with that. Anything that can differentiate between
Mm-hmm.
what's imaginary and real is evidence. Doesn't matter if it's natural or supernatural or verifiable. Anything that can do that is evidence. So I'm not assuming the natural here. I'm not assuming testable, verifiable predictions. You can get rid of that completely. I don't need any of that. You just need to provide me some
Oh, I just
evidence.
lost you again.
Oh, shoot. All right. Let me know when I'm back.
No, I think you're saying that if correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just counting on you to be able to hear me. It sounds to me like you are saying that in order for the miracle, even if the entire world saw the miracle happen, that in order for that miracle to be veridical, we have to be able to say, well, let's experiment on it and let's make it subject to experiment, even though we all saw it. That is not good enough evidence. Is that what you're saying?
No, no. So again, that's just an irrelevant point. That was just a comment to explain my position. So my only point here is that in order to have a justified, can you hear me again, right? You can hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. So in order to have a justified belief, you need some kind of evidence that can differentiate between imaginary and real. And this applies to everything, just absolutely everything, not just miracles and magic, but particles, chairs, zebras, everything. This is because this is a part of my epistemology. I apply all knowledge to everything equally. So in order to have any justified belief of absolutely anything that exists in the world and isn't just a part of our head, you need some kind of evidence that can differentiate between the imaginary and the real, which is why the magic 8 ball doesn't work, because the magic 8 ball can't do it. So the magic 8 ball does not make a justified belief about what exists in the world. Now I'm saying that testimony fails for the same reason magic 8 balls fail, because testimony can't differentiate between the imaginary and the real. We have lots of testimony of Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, miracles, magic, homeopathy, ghosts, all kinds of things. We know testimony completely fails to be able to differentiate the imaginary from the real. So it is not a reliable source of evidence, just like the magic 8 ball is not a reliable source of evidence because it can't differentiate between the imaginary and the real. So in order to make the resurrection reasonable to believe, you need some kind of evidence that can differentiate between the imaginary and the real. Doesn't matter what it is. You don't need to use
But
science.
that again just sounds like the same thing that I pointed out to you is that if I know that the resurrection is true, then I can differentiate between the imaginary and the real. I cannot differentiate between the imaginary or the real. Therefore, I do not know that the resurrection happened.
No, no,
That
no,
is
no, no.
essentially,
Again, I'm not saying anything about whether or not the
isn't that?
resurrection happened. It's all about justification. It's not about truth. There is no statement of truth here at all. This is only about justification. Truth, I'm just granting. We're just going to grant it's true. The resurrection happened. Makes no difference at all to the question. All I'm saying is it justified?
Well, I think that let's just go ahead and say that I think we're going to have to sort of be willing to look at the evidence if we're going to have any way of. I think that looking at the evidence is going to take you quite a bit closer towards certainty, if that's the goal, than would be this type of an argument. I think we have to look at the evidence itself. The evidence for the resurrection is obviously this is the most important miracle for myself, for anybody that believes as I do as a Christian. This is the most important miracle. There are other miracle claims, and we've got to be able to actually assess the claims on the basis of the evidence that lies behind those claims. And so, if there are alternative hypotheses that outweigh this naturalistic one, then that is, they explain the general facts that are agreed to by the majority of New Testament scholars. In that case, I think we've got to be able to say that that the resurrection never happened. But if the opposite turns out to be true, why wouldn't that count? And from what you're saying is essentially is because no literary witness, no testimony would, even if everyone saw the resurrection happen in front of their eyes, that this marvelous miracle that we had all corporately beheld as a human people is insufficient. And I just think on the basis of that, then why is the universe, which is beholden to my eyes and to behold to the eyes of every other person on the planet, why is that real? To me, that just seems to be to lead to so many perplexing philosophical problems that I just don't know how we would begin to surmount if we have to exercise that level of doubt.
Well, again, that was not a part of my argument. That was just a qualification. It has nothing to do with my argument. So again, my argument is simply that we need some kind of evidence that can differentiate between the imaginary and the real in order to make a belief justified. I mean, would you agree with that? That's why the magic 8 ball is not good. We need some way to differentiate between the imaginary and the real for it to count as evidence.
No,
you don't agree with that?
I think this is what I think. And so for me, one of the problems with this is that, if you know anything about epistemology, and I'm just granting that you do. So you mentioned zebras a moment ago. Have you ever heard of Fred Dretske?
Nope.
Fred Dretske essentially was a person that attempted to implode skepticism by divesting it of something called the closure principle. Others call it the principle of deductive closure. What have you? Contrary consequence elimination principle, it's been called. It's been called a lot of things. But essentially, the contrary consequence elimination principle says that if P and Q are contraries, and if I know that P, then I know that not Q. I do not know that not Q, therefore I do not know that P. That would be essentially the skeptic's argument. Well, Klein claimed that he found an example that showed that the contrary consequence elimination principle, or the closure principle, was actually not a valid principle of epistemology. He said, if I know, for example, I'm standing in a zoo and I look at a zebra and I say that's a zebra standing in front of me, do I know that it's not a cleverly disguised mule set up there to trick me? Do I know that that's not the case? It appears that I do not know that that's not the case. Therefore, I do not know that it's a zebra. And to me, these kinds of arguments that essentially say that we cannot differentiate, we're unable, just even in principle, to investigate whether or not this is just imagination. And we've got to be able to sort of devise some system to know, other than the testimony itself, that that's somehow wrong. Incidentally, Peter David Klein from Rutgers University is one of my favorite philosophers. He essentially said there is good evidence to show that not Q, and the evidence is P. So P itself is the evidence that Q is false in this case, or the presence of a miracle is the proof that we can know that it's not imaginary, as you say. And just to me, it just seems that if we go to the extreme of saying that, well, P can't ever be justified, essentially,
again, I never said that. So again, my position is just, we know, you agree the magic 8 ball is not reasonable. Why is the magic 8 ball not reasonable?
The magic 8 ball is not reasonable because it's fully dependent upon, it would seem, stochastic processes that are utterly random in order to produce the answers that it's giving. And so therefore it's not proceeding from some kind of an intelligent agent, and therefore the information is unreliable.
Well, that wouldn't follow, because even if it was a stochastic system, a random system, it could still produce the right answers, and so it would still be a reliable source of knowledge.
That's the lottery problem. But that wouldn't count as knowledge, right?
I'm being more specific.
Go back to the Gettier case, right? The guy that's got the six quarters in his pocket sitting there in the office, and he knows that the person who's going to get the job has 6 quarters because the boss has told him that I'm going to give the person sitting from across from you, I'm going to give that guy the job, and he's going to get it. But what he doesn't realize is that he's got 6 quarters in his own pocket, and he's going to get the job because the boss is going to change his mind. Now, was his belief true? Yes. Was it justified? Well, there was a reasonable justification there. Is it a belief? Yeah, he believes it. Therefore, it's knowledge? No, something's missing from the equation. So I think that that's the kind of thing is that even in the case that the 8-ball does produce the right answer, I think we've got to go and say, but on the basis of the Gettier cases, we can still say that that's not knowledge.
Well, no, I totally agree. So I'm not going that deep into the problem. My analysis is pretty surface level here. So I'm just saying, in order to make any belief justified ever, you need some way to indicate, not prove. You
Right, the
don't need absolute
repeatable.
certainty. No, not repeatable. That's my choice methodology.
Okay.
You just need a methodology to differentiate between whether something is imaginary and real, not with 100% certainty. Just make it more likely. If it makes it a single percent
Yes,
more likely to
but
be.
we don't have a method for devising the knowledge that we know that we're not living in the matrix, and so therefore that's got to be possible too. And again, that to me is just so we
That's
have to
not relevant to the
investigate the
point,
sort
though.
of the, but it's still inescapably true if what you're saying is right, and that's the problem is that this is sort of part of the pre-theoretical intuitions that are
No.
leading to
Let's
this
go with that
false.
example. Let's go with that example. So, for example, if I'm
Okay.
imagining a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn in front of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter if we're in the
Yes.
Matrix. This is still true. It doesn't matter if we're a brain in the vat. This is still true. It doesn't matter if we're in a universe made by God or pantheism. This is still true. No matter what the fundamental nature of reality is, there is always some difference between my imagination and my experience. When I imagine a
Yep.
unicorn, I do not see a unicorn. So
Mm-hmm.
when I say there is some
Yeah.
difference between my imagination and what's real, I'm talking about the thing that we experience around us as the world independent of ourselves, regardless of what that is. It doesn't matter if it's idealistic. It doesn't matter if we're in the matrix. There is a difference between these two things, the thing in our head, our imagination, and the things in the world. Now, if you're claiming that something exists in this world, regardless of what the world is, whether it's in the matrix or not, you need some way to show it's not one of the things in your head. It doesn't matter if this is a true thing. It doesn't matter if we're in the matrix. It doesn't matter if we're being deluded by Descartes' demon. You still need to show that it's not one of the imaginary things in your head. So the qualification I'm making here isn't a qualification between fake and
Yeah.
absolutely true. I'm just
But
making the
they're
distinction between the stuff in our head, our imagination,
mm-hmm.
and the apparent world around us, regardless of whatever that is.
But their client argues that P itself is the thing that shows that Q is false. I think that's a good. Personally, I think that's a good argument because if that isn't true, then we have to surrender. For example, the transitivity principle. We've got our transmissibility principle. Pardon. We've got to surrender the contrary consequence elimination principle. It seems to me that things like that are just foundational to knowledge. So if the resurrection itself is insufficient to prove the resurrection and ergo miracles exist, or just let's just move the resurrection off the table. What about just any miracle that is backed up by some sort of a testimony or a literary witness from history? To me, this just poses great epistemic dilemmas. This kind of, to me, that's why I say that it sounds indistinguishable from skepticism.
Well, no. Remember, I
And
agreed that if there was actually evidence from what I would consider evidence of miracles happening, then it would be reasonable to infer that into the past and history. It would apply. I totally agree with that. Just like it applies in the case of I saw a dog to imply historical
what
events.
about my friend?
Yes, if that was true.
So if he laid hands on the guy's stomach and the guy grew 9 feet of intestine in the hospital, there was medical documentation to all this. So you're saying that not only do we need that medical documentation, but every person in the world, even if everyone saw this
No.
man
Again,
grow
that's
9 feet of
irrelevant. That's
intestine.
irrelevant to the argument. Has nothing to do with my position at all. That was just a qualification. Has nothing to do with my position. So again, if that was evidence, if that was supported, if you have some
But it
evidence that can
was.
support, that can show that it was not an imaginary thing, yes, that is evidence of miracles. Yes, it's reasonable to infer that in the past. I don't
Yeah.
believe it meets that standard, but that isn't a debate for me. I can't debate the evidentiary support of those kinds of miracle claims. Those would need to be done by actual scientists who can do the actual tests. So so that isn't an area that I can debate. I'm just going to say that I don't see those as having met the criteria, just like most scientists don't see those. There's sufficiently huge criticisms of both books of Habermas and shoot, I forgot his name now.
Oh, of course, I would grant that there are criticisms.
So
Of course, I would grant that.
and
Absolutely.
and from
Yeah,
my
because I
perspective,
know that this is hotly debated.
right,
Absolutely.
right. So
I'm not under any illusion to the contrary.
right. So from my perspective, the criticisms outweigh the evidence that they've presented. It shows why it's faulty. But that isn't a debate I'm having here. My only point here is that We need some way to differentiate between our imagination and our experience of reality. I'm not saying we need some way to give absolute certainty of the fundamental nature of reality. That doesn't make a difference. We could still say we're in the matrix and what we're experiencing is completely false, but it's still different from the things we're imagining. So we still need a way to differentiate between those two.
Right. Right. Yeah. And to me, again, because it sounds no different than the evil genius argument, for example. Like, what if there are some alien race that is somewhere billions of years away from our star system that is put out some sort of a strange signal that causes all of the people down here to falsely believe that they, for example, have hands when they don't really have hands? Um, what is that would obviously be just the sheer presence of that. That would be a defeater to a whole host, a numberless host of propositions that basically, as that thinkers basically believe are within our ken. And to me, that's any argument that works that way is an appeal. It sounds like an appeal to skepticism, and if it is an appeal to skepticism, the question is the skeptic's question proceeding from legitimate epistemic principles? I would say that it's arguing on the basis of principles which, if true, would support the skeptic's argument. I believe that's true in a lot of cases. And then I would say that it also misinterprets at least one valid epistemic principle, which would be the contrary consequence elimination principle, or the principle of inductive closure.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying,
or
but
deductive closure.
I think you may be misunderstanding my argument. So I'm not saying anything about truth here. So this doesn't apply to skepticism at all because it has nothing to do with the truth of the claim. Regardless of whether or not we have hands that are being presented to us by aliens or whether or not we actually have hands is completely irrelevant. It makes no difference. No skeptical position has any difference to my argument at all because I'm not making a statement of truth here. I'm only talking about justification. So, for example, if I see an apple in front of me,
so then that would be an admission. Then, if it's not a statement about truth, but it's only a matter of justification, then that would mean that your claim that miracles don't happen would not be knowledge.
I never said they
Because
didn't happen.
it has to have truth and justification,
right.
and you're believing it.
I never said miracles don't happen.
minimally.
I never, ever said miracles don't happen. That was never a claim of mine. My claim is only, does the evidence make belief in miracles justified to believe? Just like my claim about God, is there reason to believe in God? I don't claim there is no God. I don't claim there is no miracles. I make no statements about ontology at all. What does exist isn't something I can say. Miracles could be happening. Jesus could have been resurrected from the dead. I do not argue against those.
Aren't you curious?
Argue justification. I'm only curious about what we have reason to believe. If we don't have reason to believe it, I'm going to say it's imaginary from my epistemology. So no, I don't care about whether it's true. I want to know if there's justification because that's the only means to get to anything. So again, my claim is only a claim about justification. If we see an apple in front of us and we can interact with that apple, like make testable predictions about it, it could still be in the matrix, but it's definitely not one of the imaginary things. It has met the criteria to be not an imaginary thing, even if it's in the matrix.
But the argument for the matrix is that the apple would be imaginary.
No. Again, so the distinction here I'm making is imaginary as in literally the thing I'm in my head and nothing more. So like if I am imagining a unicorn or imagining an apple in my head and I see an apple in front of me, those are two separate objects, the thing in my head and the thing that I see in front of me. The thing that I see in front of me could be a result of the matrix, or it could be the result of like a brain in the vat. And so it could be a different layer of imaginary, but it is not the same as the imaginary in my head. There's still a difference between those two things. So that's the distinction I'm making.
Oh, you're saying, so let me see if I'm hearing this right. You're saying that the matrix not only cleverly simulates external reality, but also internal.
No, I'm just saying.
In other words, that you're thinking of an apple right now versus eating an apple. You're saying even if that was imaginary, it was in the matrix, at least I know that when I'm in the matrix, I know the difference between when I'm imagining and when I'm actually having an apple in my hand. But in that case, that there's still another tier upwards that even those imaginations, these things that are happening, I think this gets at sort of the cogito ergo sum.
Right. When you talk
therefore I am.
Right. That leads to the metaphysical question. But here, the only distinction I'm making is between the thing I'm imagining and the thing I'm seeing. Now that it could be like we're in an idealistic universe and everything is imaginary. That's totally possible. But there's still going to be a difference between the thing I'm imagining in my head, which I visualize, and the thing I'm imagining, which is a part of the world. Those are two separate
Hmm.
kinds of things. Now, I'm going to call those imaginary and real, which is the labels I'm using, but it doesn't make a difference at all. We know these are different classes of things. They're different in some sense. They could be like imaginary level 1 and imaginary level 2. Doesn't make a difference. We still need a way to differentiate between those two categories. Is this one of the things in my direct imagination, or is this one of the things
Hmm.
in the apparent world around us? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah, well, I think it does. I mean, it sounds. What I'm hearing you say is that essentially, to me, that sounds virtually indistinguishable on dual counts because of its undeniable use of the closure principle in the way that it formulates it, which is the same suspect usage of it in the skeptic's argument, and on the case that it ends with the same familiar threat of anti-knowledge, and so that's
Well, again,
why.
no, this is totally unrelated to skepticism. It doesn't even parallel. There's no parallel at all because there's no
Hmm.
claim of knowledge. It doesn't care whether or not knowledge is possible or not possible. It's just irrelevant to the argument. So this has no parallel to skepticism at all.
Well, it is relevant to the argument. You're saying that you can't have knowledge of the thing if you can't distinguish between what's in your head and what's out there in the real world, aren't you?
It can't be justified. Whether or not it's, well, then it wouldn't be knowledge
That's what the
because,
skeptic is saying too, is that there's some condition of knowledge that cannot be met, even in principle.
and
That's what the
I'm
skeptic is
and I'm
saying.
not saying that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying it can be met. You just need a way to meet it.
Well, if you're saying that all of us could see something
Again,
and
not
yet
relevant
still
to my
all
argument
be
at all. Not,
mistaken,
I've said this multiple times. That has nothing to do with my argument at all. That was just a clarification. It has nothing to do with my argument at all. So again, my argument is just,
you don't believe that then?
it's a different part of my epistemology that has other connotations to it. It has nothing to do with the argument I'm presenting.
Well, since it's part of the sort of the set of, properly speaking, pre-theoretical intuitions which are
No,
serving
no,
this
no. It's
argument.
it's an unrelated thing. It's a different part of my epistemology. It has nothing to do with the argument I'm presenting. The only argument I'm presenting is we have to have a way to differentiate. Is it one of the things that appears to be in our head when we have visualized things? We're going to call this imaginary, or is it one of the things that appears to be in the world that we sense with our senses? Sense experience
Right.
and imaginary are different
So therefore,
classes
if
of
you saw
things.
if you saw a miracle in front of you that happened, would you say that this thing was just simply the product of your own imagination?
Until we get
Because you can't tell the difference between here and here.
correct.
Yeah.
So we need
So
some
to
additional
me,
evidence for that.
even Descartes said that if I exercise my will properly, I can avoid being deceived. Huh. I guess that, to me, if there were, in addition to my own personal perceptions, other facets of the case for the miracle that were external, then I would be constrained in that case to agree that the external signs were indeed an indication that I had not conjured up or imagined the miracle. I think I would have to admit that, because there are these external things that are happening around me, and I think that's essentially the quality of testimony that comes, for example, in the case of the resurrection, or in the case of the miracle that occurred in the life of, excuse me, my friend Bruce Venata.
Right, so I agree with the first part of what you said exactly. That's exactly what I'm asking for, is something like that, some quality, some kind of thing that can
Yeah,
differentiate between the imaginary and the real. That would
yeah, the
do it.
resurrection has got that.
And I would say my position is that it doesn't, because all the things that you provide are kind of like the
Gotcha.
eight ball. They don't really work because they're just those stochastic kind of systems that can't differentiate between these two things.
So the you think that the authoring of Scripture is utterly random? Oh, it doesn't
Uh,
show signs of that at all. The claims of the text don't show those kinds of
that
signs.
that wasn't
They
a
do
literal
externally
comparison. I wasn't saying it's literally random. I was saying it's equivalently justifiable as a random object.
as a stochastic process. Yeah.
Yes. So it's
Wow.
equal justification for the
Yeah.
existence of miracles.
Right. Yeah. I don't think I could see it that way, because everyone knows, for example, that had appearances with the risen Christ, that there was something that the disciples saw something that dramatically changed their Judaism. What in the world did they see? Why did they then become willing to go to preach and risk their own lives? In this case, this has been something that has troubled a lot of people. I'm sure you probably have heard of the testimony, for example, of Josh McDowell. Josh McDowell, who essentially said, I just, this was the thing that for me, this broke it. This broke the argument against it, the contra it. Because for him, he said, I just can't accept that those men orchestrated their own death by the words, their testimony of their lips. And if you would say that they didn't orchestrate their own death,
I grant
at least minimally, we have to say that it certainly, that would have been a live option that they would have been aware of, which should have prevented them. I think I have the quote here from, this is an older quote, mind you, but I think it's still a very, very relevant quote. Here we have William Paley. I don't know if you're familiar with that name.
The Paley's Watch.
Right. Yeah. Essentially, he wrote a very compelling argument for the resurrection. This is what Paley said, quote, "The ruling party at Jerusalem had just crucified the founder of the religion. They who stood forth to preach must necessarily reproach these rulers with an execution they could not but represent as a murder." He then went on to say, quote, "Ordinarily speaking, nothing can overcome the indolence of mankind, the love of cheerful society, or the desire of personal freedom, but conviction." That's really appropriately stated. I think this kind of gets at the heart of the issue here is that something happened which definitely dramatically altered their Judaism. How in the world did that happen? And essentially, this is where the rubber meets the road on the whole argument. I think personally that we have to conclude that the source of the message itself, the events surrounding it, was deeply resting because the movement of early Christianity could not have started otherwise. Something powerful had to occur to generate the belief that Jesus of Nazareth was now risen from the dead. And so claiming rabbinic Judaism with its focus on ritual purity had somehow birthed a pagan hybrid is simply unrealistic. Whatever the disciples saw, whatever they saw, it dramatically altered their Judaism without the aid of stories borrowed from ancient cultic myths. And from that point, the case for Easter begins to narrow significantly because the list of probable options just dramatically shrinks. Hallucinations, we would know, become an unlikely candidate for producing religious visions which were so different from their early Jewish beliefs. The fact that skeptical scholarship has argued a pagan route to Easter suggests that the case indeed cries out for some kind of external inspiration. It needs it. And so hallucinations cannot account for the disciples' vision, since religiously inspired delusions are just projections of our own imaginations and minds. And so,
just to jump in, like that wasn't an argument I ever made. So my position is that the disciples did have some kind of life-changing event which caused them to do things which could have led to their death. That's totally
yes.
fine. But so did the people who follow Falun Gong and Buddhism and Jainism and all kinds of religions all over the world. So
I grant that that's true, of course.
So the fact that has anything to do with its truth would not lend any more credence to Christianity than it would to any of those other religions or beliefs.
Right. But then again, this is right back to the problem that we pointed out. If I know the P, then I know the not Q, which is all the other religions. I do not know the not Q.
No. Again, that's skepticism and has nothing to do with my position. So my position is that that's a magic 8 ball. You're just using a magic 8 ball to try and justify your beliefs. So that's not a reliable source of knowledge. We have plenty of reliable sources. That isn't one of them. That can be reliable for things that have an empirical basis, like people had belief, people died, people did those things. All of those are reasonable to believe based off of that evidence. The miracle happened isn't one of them because we know that testimony can't adjudicate those kinds of claims. It just fails every time throughout history with complete failure rate. for everything. Miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs,
Well,
every testimony.
in order to know that, Tom, you would have had to have undergone that type of research over every miracle claim,
No, no, I
and I
don't.
just think that no
That's
one person is
fallibilism.
in the
Fallibilism. Like
position.
if you claim that there is a black goose and we have no evidence of black geese, that's a reason to reject the hypothesis there is a black goose. I don't need to prove there's no black goose, but I can reject any of your claim that you have until you actually present
But that
evidence.
doesn't mean you're right.
Correct. This is a
Just like
justification
in the
thing.
just as in the case of the black swan, those that thought that there was no black swan, that was no justification that there was no black swan.
Again,
The
I'm not
resurrection was a
claiming.
black swan.
Again, I'm not claiming there are no
Can't.
miracles. That's not my claim. My claim is that it's just unjustified to believe there are miracles. I'm not claiming there are no miracles. That's not the
But
point.
the discovery of the black swan showed that the white swan, the belief that there were only white swans, was itself unjustifiable. It was an
No,
unjustified belief.
no. Beliefs can be
So
justified. Beliefs can be justified if they're false. Beliefs can be justified if they're false.
That's precisely my point. This shows that the claim that I know that there's no miracle that's happening here. This certainly wouldn't be knowledge. It's just a belief. How do you
Right.
test a belief?
Uh, if you can
And
have
that's
the point is to test the justification, not the belief. So I'm arguing that your belief is unjustified, my belief is justified. We both have
Mhm.
beliefs. We don't know which one is true, but we can show conclusively that the naturalist side is the justified one, is my argument.
Yeah. I just don't see why that would be true, because by definition, by Nassim Taleb's own definition, the resurrection was a black swan event. It's completely unforeseen previously, had a massive impact, and afterwards, people were trying to figure out ways to show that it had been predictable. It fits precisely that theory. And Taleb's point is that you can't say on the basis of all the other white swans that the black one never happens.
Well,
And
right.
so,
I mean,
of course, his conclusions, that history is totally random, that we can never, predict the future, etc. I hold reservations in basically everything else in that book. So I want to say that. I want to at least, on record saying that.
well, yeah,
Um,
but kind of like the example of general relativity and Einstein. If he did one test that was there, no other test could ever be shown to verify general relativity, it would have been immediately rejected. The fact that you can only do it once is sufficient, even if you did do it once. That's the problem. Even if it's a black swan event, if you can't show here's the black swan, you can see it multiple times and all these other kinds of things. The fact that it happened one time, even if I grant it happened one time, means it's not justifiable to believe. Because the fact that it happened one time can't differentiate between imaginary and real.
mm, mm. Yeah, as you think about Albert Einstein, old Einstein, I mean, didn't he say that none of his experiments proved that anything was true, that these processes, which were, essentially they were repeatable, et cetera, that they didn't prove that anything was what it was? He said that 100 rightly predicted experiments would not show that I'm right in what I'm saying, but a single false outcome would show that I'm wrong. And so it seems that type of a process, even in the eyes of Albert Einstein, would not show that something is true.
The
And so
truth, right? It
therefore,
doesn't show the truth, but it
if the
does show the
scientific method
justification.
wouldn't do that, if it wouldn't do that, then why would the same process show that the miracle event that happened is true? Because we showed it by repeated experiment, et cetera.
No, I
Doesn't
grant
seem
that.
to me
Again, we're not
that
talking
that
about
would be
truth.
an insufficient ground for saying it.
I agree.
Again, you've
I
got to
agree
go
with
back to
everything
P
you just said.
itself.
I agree
Yeah,
with
P itself.
everything you just
Good.
said. Problem is that, again, I'm not talking about truth. I'm just talking about justification. If we have 100,000 experiments that are all confirmed, that does give you justification, even if it doesn't tell you truth. And that's what Einstein was saying. It doesn't prove him right. Nothing in science is ever proven. It's always tentative and provisional. So, but you can get justification for believing something in science.
That's precisely my point. So showing that it's everything has to be tentative and provisional according to the scientific method. Well, then the scientific method cannot be used to show that miracles are valid.
I don't follow what you're saying.
We would be stuck in eternal skepticism on the point of
Truth.
miracles being valid, because the scientific method is not a means that we use to show that a given conclusion or a given outcome is right.
Correct. It doesn't show the truth. It only shows the justification. And all I'm arguing for is the justification.
Yeah, it seems, but if you're going to presuppose that P itself cannot be used as that justification, that to
I
me
never
seems
did.
you can't. You're saying that the resurrection itself can't prove it, and so we've got to do some sort of scientific experiment to show that it's repeatable.
Well,
That
you
seems to
just
have been your argument all
no.
along.
That's not no. My argument isn't that the resurrection doesn't work. My argument is that you need something that can differentiate between imaginary and real. And if the resurrection could do that, then it would work as evidence. I don't think it can. But if it so
Yeah,
anything that can do that, anything that can differentiate between those two is evidence.
you're right, right. And the famous foreboding threat of anti-knowledge. Yeah.
No, again, not has nothing to do with skepticism there. But
It just
we've been
sounds so
going
much like it to me, Tom.
we've been going for a little
Well,
over an hour, so we should probably
yeah,
wrap up pretty soon.
that's fine. That's fine.
All right.
Yep.
I really enjoyed
Okay.
talking with you. Thanks for coming on.
I,
Love to
I
talk to you
really
again
enjoyed
sometime.
talking with you, Tom. I hope that you know that. I hope that
Oh,
everybody
absolutely.
knows it.
And we should
Okay.
do a live debate sometime because we live really close by.
Yeah, yeah, we should. You're right. You're right. We should do that. We
Yeah.
should do that. So apparently, since we're both living and or both residents of Minnesota,
Yeah.
that we should do that sometime. Yeah,
Yeah.
and get together a group of people. So that would be wonderful. Well,
Awesome.
hopefully we've given everyone a good show.
Yeah.
If anybody's been able to follow this, they must be philosophers. Um,
Uh, well,
so, all right.
yeah, I'm
Go
getting
ahead. Go
hungry. I
ahead.
got to get something to eat.
Yep. Go
Love
for it.
talking with you.
Yeah. Fun talking with you, man.
See you later.
All right. Bye. Bye. Bye.